Hey, this is Art from My New Microphone, and today I'd like to discuss a rarely mentioned side effect of EQ, and that side effect is phase shifting, particularly frequency-dependent phase shifting dependent on where the EQ is either boosting or cutting frequencies. By EQing a track or audio signal, we will be altering the phase of the frequencies targeted by the EQ. Altering the phase of one track relative to the other tracks in the mix, even if only at specific frequencies targeted by the EQ, can lead to destructive interference between these tracks that will act detrimentally in the mix. Worst of all, we are unlikely to even know about these phase shifts simply by looking at the EQ graph, which has the frequencies along the x-axis and the gain along the y-axis. So, why does EQ cause phase shift? Well, if we were to open up analog EQ and check out the circuitry, we would see for each order of the filter, we would have a reactive component, typically a capacitor, but sometimes an inductor, especially in passive EQ, that would act to cause a phase shift, particularly at the corner or cutoff frequency or the center frequency, depending on what type of EQ move that specific circuit is designed to produce. Higher order filters, those that are either steeper or narrower, again, depending on the type of EQ move, will have more reactive components within their circuitry. So, in other words, the steeper or narrower the EQ move, the greater the phase shift will be. I will show you this momentarily as we do some tests inside my computer where I'll be showing my screen, but typically a high-pass filter will cause a positive phase shift at and below the corner frequency, while a low-pass filter will cause a negative phase shift at and above its corner frequency. High shelf boosts or low shelf cuts will cause a positive phase shift at their corner frequency before leveling out, while low shelf boosts and high shelf cuts will cause a negative phase shift at their corner frequency before leveling out. Bell-type EQ filters, which are the typical ones we are discussing when talking about boosting or cutting certain frequencies in the mix, will have a center frequency which has zero phase shift, and then above or below we will have a positive and a negative phase shift. Again, I will show you these in a more visual representation momentarily when we get into the computer. Once again, altering the phase of one track relative to the others with EQ in the mix can cause destructive interference, which can be particularly noticeable in lower frequencies, which have longer wavelengths that are more sensitive to any phase shifts. So exaggerated EQ moves in the low end may cause more issues than we may expect by simply looking at the EQ curve. Before ever getting into a mix, it's important to look at the multi-tracks within a session, that is the actual audio files, and have a look at how the phase relationship between tracks is. Having appropriate phase relationships between the tracks in our mix, that is basically lining up the positive amplitudes of tracks with the positive amplitudes of the other tracks, and likewise with the negative amplitudes, can lead to a more powerful and clear mix. In contrast, having poor phase relationships between the tracks in our mix can lead to lackluster results and even sessions that are virtually unmixable. I actually have a video on the topic of ensuring proper phase relationships between tracks before we start mixing. I will include a link to that video in the description box below. And extending this idea to EQ, it's important to keep in mind how EQ will alter the phase, especially when we work so hard to get the phase right in the first place. So let's go through a few EQ tips to ensure that the phase shifting isn't too severe. The first tip is that subtle is often better when it comes to making EQ moves, not only for phase shift reasons, because the more subtle an EQ is, the less phase shift there will be, but also for making the tracks sound more natural even though we are processing them with EQ. The second tip is to never EQ for just EQ's sake. EQ is an invaluable mixing tool in the mixing engineer's toolbox, but not every track warrants it. And the third tip is to use a top-down approach, where we begin by processing the mix bus before moving on to instrument buses and subgroups, and then getting to individual tracks. It's often the case that we can forego using many plugins within a mix session by simply processing a bus of instruments rather than each instrument individually. That way, all the instruments feeding into the bus are being phase shifted by a single EQ rather than having slightly different EQ moves on each individual track, which would cause much more phase issues between each of those tracks. I should also mention the use of linear phase EQ, which is effectively designed to get rid of any phase shift in the audio signal. We can save ourselves a lot of grief dealing with phase issues by simply using a linear phase EQ. That being said, there is no such thing as a free lunch, and linear phase EQ does come with its own downsides, namely high CPU usage and the introduction of pre-ringing to the signal, where there's effectively an echo before a track will actually produce sound. Also, linear phase EQs are really only available as software or audio plugins. These downsides are, however, often negligible with the power of modern computers, and the pre-ringing is really only distracting when we're really pushing the EQ hard. So with that, let's hop into my computer to have a better visual look at how EQ affects frequency-dependent phase shift, and we will also go through a few tests to see how EQ alters the actual waveforms of the tracks that it is set to process within a mix. All right, here we are inside of my computer, and on the left-hand side, we have the FabFilter Pro Q3. This is one of my favorite EQ plugins, and we will be using this for our examples of phase shift because it offers both a natural phase, which is the typical EQ we'll be using, as well as a linear phase mode here, which will not cause any phase shift over here. And what we have on the right-hand side is an application called Plugin Doctor, and this will show us the amount of phase shift happening in this EQ right here. So this is actually outside of Logic, even though you see that Logic is in the background. We're actually running a separate application here. We have Plugin Doctor on phase mode, and you'll notice here that we have frequencies along the x-axis, and along the y-axis we have radians. And the way to convert between radians and degrees to better understand phase shift in terms of degrees is you take the number of radians multiplied by 180 divided by pi. And so at positive 3.14, essentially pi, up here we have a positive 180 degree phase shift, and at negative 3.14 down here we have a negative 180 degree phase shift. So from bottom to top, or top to bottom, we have a full 360 degree scale to work with. As we move forward and get into more aggressive EQ moves, we will have instances where we either go beyond plus 180 or beyond negative 180 degrees, at which point we'll have strange looking graphs on here, where there will essentially be a vertical line as it kind of crosses over and then starts out down here, or vice versa. I will reiterate this when we see it through this example. So let's get started looking at how EQ affects phase shift. So we are going to go over here to our EQ plugin, make sure that we're on natural phase rather than linear phase. And let's start with a simple high pass filter here. FabFilter calls it a low cut, tomato, tomato. And we see here we have a 12 dB per octave high cut at, let's call this 200 Hertz. And we can see here at the 200 Hertz, we have a positive 90 degree or 1.57 radian. I'll be using degrees as much as possible. So at the cutoff frequency, again, we have a positive 90 degree phase shift. And then as we continue downward here, as we start eliminating frequencies, we max out at a positive 180. If we were to turn this into a low pass or a high cut filter, we would see the exact opposite. So again, we have a cutoff at 200 Hertz. We have a negative 90 degree phase shift at the cutoff frequency. And then as we begin rolling off the frequencies, we will max out at about negative 180 degrees here. So now let's look at what happens when we increase the slope. Let's just double the slope of this low pass filter to 24 decibels per octave. And here we see that strange thing that I was talking about before. So we have basically no phase shift. And then as we reach the cutoff frequency, again at 200 Hertz, we have negative 180. And then we can imagine this curve as continuing to go down. But because we only have this scale with Plugin Doctor, we are going to shoot up vertically and then go down like this. But instead of this going from, plus 180 down to 0, it's actually going from negative 180 degrees down to negative 360 degrees. So we can see that there's a phase shift of a complete cycle as we get up to about 10,000 Hertz or so. Of course, at 10,000 Hertz, the frequencies are far gone, but I just wanted to show you the overall phase shift caused by a, in this case, low pass filter. And we can go back to our high pass filter or low cut right here. And we see here that this doesn't change. However, what we have is these are the pass band, these frequencies up here. So starting here, we have 0 phase shift. And then as we get to our cutoff frequency at 200, we have an actual plus 180 degree phase shift. And then as we continue to roll off, we go from, again, positive 180 up to positive 360. So perhaps this isn't the best tool to show you exactly how the phase shift happens in degrees, but I just really wanted to hone in on how the phase shift happens and have an actual application to show us. If you happen to know of an application or a plugin that shows the phase shift of an EQ in terms of degrees, please let me know down in the comments below. And if you're finding this informative thus far, go ahead and hit that like button. Thanks. All right, moving on beyond filters, let's quickly have a look at shelves. So we'll start with a high shelf here. Let's go up to 1000 degrees and let's give a boost of say 6 dB. So here we see that at the corner frequency of this high shelf filter, we have a phase shift of, I would call that maybe 37.5. And as we increase the amount of boost here, we increase the amount of phase shift. But notice in a high shelf filter that we have a phase shift that culminates at the corner frequency and then goes right back down. Similarly, if we go a high shelf cut, let's go -12, we have the same phase shift, only negative in this case. And that is about halfway between -45 and -90. This will be similar for a low shelf filter, but I'll just show you that quickly as well. In this case, we just have the opposite of what we had in a high shelf, where a low shelf cut will lead to a positive phase shift and a low shelf boost will lead to a negative phase shift. And just by looking at the EQ curves here, we can see the similarities between a low shelf cut and a high shelf boost, or a low shelf boost and a high shelf cut. All right, moving on now to the bell type curves, the typical boosts and cuts we will be using in EQ. We see that in a bell curve boost in an EQ, we have the situation where the phase shift acts positively as it reaches toward the center frequency here, and then rapidly drops back down to 0 at the center frequency at 1000 hertz. See? And then as we start going back down, we have a negative phase shift here before going back to 0 as the EQ curve flattens out. If we were to take this curve and make it a cut, say at -6 dB, we would see the opposite here. Where as we approach the center frequency of the cut, we have a slight negative phase shift and then going up through 0 and then to a positive peak phase shift before leveling back out. And as we get more and more intense with our cutoffs, we can see that the phase shift does as well. But with these bell curves, we often aren't having such dramatic phase shifts as we are with the filters. However, we should always be aware of what our EQs are doing in terms of phase. Now, at frequencies like 1000 hertz and above, phase issues typically aren't too much of an issue because the wavelengths of such frequencies are high enough and they're interacting so rapidly with each other anyway that such phase shifts aren't really going to act so detrimentally on the mix. However, when we get down to frequencies in the low end or low mids, this can be much more of an issue because one, there are often fewer tracks that have significant energy in the low end, and two, the wavelengths are so long that any phase relationships between them play a much bigger role in the actual clarity of those frequencies. Before moving on, I just wanted to show you in this plugin, the Pro Q3, the linear phase option. And as soon as I turn it to linear phase, we see that there is no phase shift whatsoever, and we can add in as many different EQ moves as we'd like, and nothing will happen in terms of phase. Okay, with that, let's now hop into Logic Pro and have a look at how phase shift can affect the audio signals of our mix. All right, here we are inside of Logic Pro, and in this little test session I have right here, I'd like to show you how the EQ moves we make will alter the phase and show you the differences in the waveforms between an original signal and that which has been affected by EQ. So in this session, we have a kick drum that we will be using to test EQ moves in the low mids. This is what that sounds like. We have an 808 right here that we will be using to test for high pass filtering. This is what that sounds like. And finally, I have a snare sample right here that we will be using to test linear phase EQ. Now, linear phase EQ gets rid of any phase shift at the expense of pre-ringing, which is essentially an echo before the sound actually starts. And I just want to go over and show you in a real obvious example what that sounds like, so that you know that there's not really any free lunch when it comes to EQ. You're either getting phase shift or you're getting pre-ringing. Now, I should note that changes in phase and in pre-ringing are typically going to be subtle. However, it's critical to still understand how EQ affects phase and to use this information in our mixes to achieve better results. So starting over here with the kick drum, I already have our EQs set up here to save time. But what I'm going to do is get rid of the low mids, which is a fairly common move on kick drums to really get that beater attack up here while still maintaining the low end thud of the kick drum. So I'll play it back a few times with and without the EQ so we can get a sense. Just kind of gets rid of that boxiness, which may or may not be necessary in the context of a mix. Again, we're not going through a full mix and looking at phase relationships in this particular test. We're just going to look at how EQ can affect the phase. So I just am going to quickly bounce this in place. I am going to go to a new track, leave it. We are not going to bypass the effects either. So here we have the original kick and the kick that has been affected by EQ. So obviously the EQ has altered the waveform of the affected signal here. We can see that particularly in the transient or the initial attack of the kick. However, when it comes to phase, we're still relatively well aligned. You see here, as we go negative in the original, we go negative in the affected signal. And as we go positive in the original, we go positive in the affected signal. However, when we scroll out, we begin to see that there's a little bit of a slip right here in terms of the phase, but it's not really that big of a deal in the mid-range here. So phase shift is definitely there. Now, is it really that big of a deal? Perhaps in the context of a mix, I would want to shift this a little bit in terms of phase to make it align just a little bit better, like so. Now, if we were to duplicate this track and copy this down and go through and play the duplicates together, versus layering the affected signal with the original. You can hear that there are differences in phase that cause a sort of destructive interference between them. Perhaps it would actually be better in the long run to have the transients more aligned to really give that big thump at the beginning. Let's listen to this. Much better sounding than the moves we made adjusting the phase toward the back end of the kick drum. So with that little experiment right there, I just wanted to show you how important phase is when it comes to transients and low end energies, and how just a slight tweak or shift of phase can really alter the way that two instruments interact with each other. In this case right here, when we took the affected kick drum and nudged it slightly early, the transients didn't really align with the original, and we ended up with a situation where the kick drum didn't sound as transient or powerful as it should. Nudging the affected kick back so that the transients aligned nicely made it so that the kick sounded much better when it was stacked together like this. So even small phase shifts can make big differences when it comes to instruments interacting with one another, which is why, again, it's important to know how EQ affects the phase of any given track. Okay, let's move on now to the 808. And with this, I have just a simple high pass filter. Let us solo this and have a look. So here is the high pass filter, and I'll play the 808 here. Let me turn it down a little bit. So we see here in the high pass filter that we're using, we're actually rolling off a little bit lower than the fundamental, which is right here at about, say, 44, 43 hertz. So we're rolling off below that just as a way to get rid of the low end rumble, to allow for better mix translatability to different subwoofers. In the studio headphones that I'm using right now, I can't really hear that well down to this point, and so I'm unable to monitor at frequencies this low. Oftentimes, it's a better approach to eliminate these frequencies altogether than to kind of make shots in the dark without being able to monitor them correctly. So let's actually make this a bit more aggressive for this example. We will go, say, 48 dB per octave. So we have a pretty sharp roll-off below the fundamental, so we're still getting the big, powerful boom of this 808. However, we are going to be eliminating, or at least attempting to eliminate, all of the audio below about 29.2 hertz as a way to get rid of anything that, one, we can't hear, and two, is just low-end noise. So let's A/B this EQ and listen to the 808 in solo. It almost sounds better in some respects by itself with this high pass filter engaged, in my opinion. And again, the reason for this could be that I'm only using headphones that don't really go down this low, but to my ears, having the high pass filter here subjectively sounds a little bit better. So let's bounce this in place. New track, leave the original source, don't bypass the effects. And now we have the original and the affected signal right here. Now, if we zoom in to compare the original against the affected 808, we see that even though we're only getting rid of quote unquote the noise from the signal, we are biting into a bit of the signal, and we can see that in the difference in waveforms. However, what I really want to mention here is that if we look at the phase, it doesn't take very long for the two to be almost completely out of phase with each other. You see right here, we've got a positive peak in the original where we're pretty much at a negative peak in the affected signal. And so if we were to continue on here, it actually goes out of phase almost entirely and stays like that for the majority of the signal. So now if we were to duplicate the original and copy it and play them together, we would have this. And now the original and the bounce in place with the effect of the high pass filter we would have. Which doesn't sound as terrible as we may expect by looking at the phase differences right here. However, it does sound slightly distorted compared to the original. So in this little experiment with the 808, I wanted to show how, yes, EQ will affect phase, especially when we are doing low-end high-pass filtering. However, it often doesn't have as big an effect as we might think it does. Of course, it's useful to know, which is why I'm showing you these tests. But it's ultimately up to us to use our ears to determine if the EQs are suitable for the mix or not. All right, and finally here, let's move on to the snare drum. I will solo this. And what I want to do with the snare drum here is just show how pre-ringing works with a linear phase EQ. So here we have the Pro QL3, which I mentioned earlier when we were looking at the phase shift through a natural phase and a linear phase EQ with Plugin Doctor. Now, if we play back this snare here, I'm going to toggle between natural phase, our typical EQ setting, and linear phase, and listen to the difference here. So here is with natural phase. This is a very aggressive 22 dB boost at 211 hertz, but this is, again, just to make things glaringly obvious for you about what pre-ringing is and how linear phase EQ has the potential to cause audible pre-ringing in the mix. So here it is without EQ to start. Now here it is with natural phase EQ. You're going to hear a big boost here. Now let's listen in linear phase. You can hear that vroom, vroom, that ringing before the snare drum actually sounds. So let's listen back to back to back, starting with the EQ off. So at pretty extreme settings like this, linear phase can cause pre-ringing that is audible in the mix. However, if we were to use a more typical boost, say 6 dB at 211, let's listen to this in linear phase. Compare that to natural phase. So it's still there, but it's not really audible. And in the greater context of a mix, we typically won't pick up on this pre-ringing on just a snare drum, for example, if we opt to use EQ moves that aren't overly exaggerated, like the 22 dB or so that we had originally here. So in this third experiment, I wanted to show you the audible effects of pre-ringing in linear phase EQ. We already had a look to prove with Plugin Doctor that it doesn't actually alter the phase, but the higher CPU loads and the propensity to cause pre-ringing are things that are worth knowing about linear phase EQ. Again, if we're using more sane EQ moves, we shouldn't be too worried about the pre-ringing in linear phase EQs. But again, I just want to make you aware of the potential pre-ringing that a linear phase EQ could cause. So with that, let's hop out of Logic Pro. So now you know how EQ affects the phase of the tracks it is processing. Take this information into all of your mixes moving forward and continue developing your knowledge of audio and music. That's what we are doing here at the My New Microphone YouTube channel. Check out the description box down below for a whole bunch of other resources I have for you. And in this end screen, I will put up a few other videos that I think are worth checking out to deepen, again, your knowledge about music and audio. So check out one of these on the screen, and I will see you in the next video.